New fallout from what the president calls an historic agreement on Iranian nukes, and the critics call a deal that will live in infamy for the dangers it poses to the world. It is July 14th, 2015, a date on which there is a clear shift in the global balance of power. What we don't know yet is whether it is a move toward peace or a Mideast nuclear arms race. Today, more than 25 years after Iran obtained the secrets to building a nuclear weapon, the U.S., its partners, and Iran reached what President Obama celebrated as a deal to limit Iran's nuclear program, which he says will make America and the world more safe.
Because America negotiated from a position of strength and principle, we have stopped the spread of nuclear weapons in this region. This deal offers an opportunity to move in a new direction.
In Iran, they are celebrating as well, rejoicing in the coming end to sanctions that had badly compromised the Iranian economy. Remember, this is the same Iran that just a few days ago was vowing death to Israel and chanting death to America. Listen. Less than 1,000 miles away in the Israeli capital, a very different reaction. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu calling this a historic mistake that gives Iran access to $100 billion and a sure path to the bomb.
By not dismantling Iran's nuclear program, in a decade this deal will give an unreformed, unrepentant, and far richer terrorist regime the capacity to produce many nuclear bombs. In fact, an entire nuclear arsenal with the means to deliver it. What a stunning, historic mistake.
A member of Mr. Netanyahu's cabinet was less delicate, saying, quote, "Today, a terrorist nuclear superpower is born, and it will go down as one of the darkest days in world history." Here is how the deal breaks down and why the critics are upset. The key part of the agreement cuts the nuclear fuel supply line by reducing stockpiles of uranium, limiting access to new supplies, and slowing the enrichment process. It creates a system of verification and inspections, and it keeps certain sanctions in place until Iran complies. But Iran gets nearly a month's notice before those inspections actually happen, and only if the overseeing nations, including Iran, agree in the first place that inspections are warranted. Iran gets its economy back. The money spigot is turned back on to a country that has repeatedly used its military and financial resources to murder Americans. Iran also gets something the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Martin Dempsey, recently said should never happen under any circumstances. A ban that's now in place on its access to arms and ballistic missiles will be lifted in 5 to 8 years, if not sooner. And when this deal runs out in less than a decade, Iran still may get the bomb. Tonight, we have Ron Dermer, the Israeli ambassador to the United States, as well as Mark Thiessen, who's a former chief speechwriter for President George W. Bush. But we begin with Fox News senior political analyst Brit Hume. Brit, your thoughts on the deal?
Well, Megan, it's not as if the United States got nothing out of this. Iran's nuclear program is hindered and delayed for a period of time. The problem, of course, is that after that period of time, the program is basically permitted. It is, I think, inevitable that Iran then becomes a nuclear power, which is something these negotiations were ostensibly designed to avoid ever happening. In addition to that, as your summation of what's going on here mentioned, the verification process to see that Iran is living up to the deal is a complex and somewhat unwieldy affair involving having a committee of nations determine whether the requested access to a certain site in Iran is necessary, and it could take up to 24 days for that all to be vindicated, and that, of course, would provide potential time for Iran to do away with anything that the inspectors might find. Now, the argument is made that that's not enough time and so forth for them to do away with it all, and we're going to be hearing all of that play out in the weeks ahead, but there it is. And in addition, of course, it was always said by the administration that these sanctions, which Iran has been so desperate to get lifted, would snap back into place were there any violations. Well, it turns out that that's not quite the way it would work either. The so-called snapback process is one in which this same committee of nations with Iran on it would have to agree to would have to go along with all that, And of course, everyone knows that once a sanctioned regime is lifted, it is exceedingly difficult to get it reimposed. And key members of that committee are European countries which are dying to resume trade with Iran and have been restrained by the fact that the international community and the UN, of course, has imposed this sanctions regime, leaving the United States in the position where it could reimpose sanctions if it chose to do so, but it would only be American sanctions and not sanctions for so much of the rest of the world. So those are a couple of the things that have set off the alarm bells that you've been talking about that have been coming from Israel and many quarters within the United States as well.
But the president came out today and spoke to some of these issues and said, consider what happens in a world without this deal. He basically said the world was tired of these sanctions, and there is support for that notion that our European partners were going to bail and others were going to bail and loosen the noose around Iran anyway. And so tightening the sanctions was not an option. And their response is, therefore, it's better to have some deal that slows down the program for a decade than to pretend we were going to get greater sanctions and crack down on Iran when the reality is we were losing our partners in that effort.
That's probably, Megyn, the best argument that can be made for this agreement. That the sanctions regime was slipping, as sanctions regimes will, and that we didn't have good options here. Some of the same people, by the way, that are making that argument on behalf of the Obama administration disputed that argument when it was made by the Bush administration as to one of the reasons we had to go after Saddam Hussein. Remember, he was supposedly hemmed in by sanctions, and that regime was beginning to slip, which is one of the reasons why he was the box that he was supposedly in. The fear was that it wasn't going to hold him for very much longer. But that aside, Megyn, that's probably the best argument that can be made, and you will hear it in many forms. One of the forms you'll hear is that it was either this deal or something very like it, or war. And some pessimists, even critics of the deal, think that may be so. John Bolton, for example, thinks that the only option now, because the deal cannot be undone, he doesn't believe, is to strike Iran, and that Israel will have to do it. So there is some support for that argument. Nevertheless, Megyn, remember this. You may recall the administration insisting that we didn't want to bring up the subject, for example, of the Americans held captive in Iran because we were trying to stick to the nuclear piece of this. Well, it turns out in this deal, as you mentioned earlier, that the ban on conventional arms sales to Iran will be lifted as well. That's the opposite of nuclear, conventional.
What's that doing in there while our hostages are still
How did that get in there at the last minute? Well, it does suggest that the administration was so eager to make a deal that it let Iran throw that concession request in at the last minute, and they got it.
Britt, thank you.
You bet.
So as Britt just mentioned, the hardest part of selling a deal with Iran is that it involves Iran. This is, of course, a country that has supplied weapons to groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, is listed as a state sponsor of terror, and is directly or indirectly responsible for killing or injuring hundreds, maybe thousands of U.S. soldiers. In fact, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, as I mentioned, made clear a week ago that in no scenario should we lift our weapons ban on this country.
Under no circumstances should we relieve pressure on Iran relative to ballistic missile capabilities and arms trafficking.
But that's what we just did. Mark Thiessen is a Fox News contributor and a former chief speechwriter. That's exactly what we did. They put it in at the last minute after they said we have to stick to nuclear. Don't talk to us about your hostages. Oh, but we'd love for you to lift this arms embargo. And we did it, even though that's Martin Dempsey saying that's a red line.
It's amazing. I mean, does Barack Obama ever listen to his military advisors about anything? I mean, the nuclear side of this deal is bad enough. But just a week ago, both his chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and his Secretary of Defense warned that under no circumstances should we be lifting the arms embargo or the restrictions on ballistic missiles. And he ignored their advice and did it. And it's not just them. General Lloyd Austin, the commander of CENTCOM, said just 4 months ago, in addition to its nuclear program, Iran has the largest, most diverse ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East. A year ago, the head of our Missile Defense Agency said that Iran could develop and test an ICBM capable of reaching the United States by 2015. So they have a one-year breakout for a ballistic missile to reach us. So not only are we paving the way for a nuclear bomb, this deal is paving the way for the missiles to deliver it.
So what is this about? I mean, because many people have said this is about Barack Obama wanting a legacy issue.
It's very much about him wanting a legacy issue. I couldn't agree more. But I mean, his legacy, his insistence on a legacy is constantly interfering with our national security. He wanted a legacy of pulling all of our troops out of Iraq. Our military commanders told him, don't do that. He did it anyway, and he's got a legacy of having given us the rise of ISIS. Now he wanted a legacy of a nuclear deal, and now our military commanders told him, don't lift the sanctions on ballistic missiles and on weapons, and he's doing it anyway.
They're getting
his legacy.
So Iran gets $100 billion, and they get access to arms and ballistic missiles within the next 5 to 8 years that our chairman of the Joint Chiefs said under no circumstances should they get. We've also lifted sanctions on some sketchy individuals, although the administration says not to worry.
Yeah, according to the Iranian side, they've put this out. The sanctions are lifted on General Qasem Soleimani, who is the terror mastermind of Iran. This man is responsible for the deaths of more Americans than any living terrorist. He's personally responsible for 1/3 of the U.S. casualties in Iraq during the Iraq War, because he created and funded the Shia militias and gave them explosively formed penetrators that killed literally hundreds of American troops. And we're lifting sanctions on him? He has nothing to do with the nuclear program. He's under sanctions for terrorism. Why are we lifting sanctions on a terrorist?
Well, they're claiming like one pot of the money is you know, they're lifting not the terrorism sanctions but other sanctions. Mark, thank you.